Harley, thank you so much for taking the time to join us once again today, and a warm welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Nigel. I'm happy. It's been a while since we've spoken.
Indeed, it has. Harley, we seem in the midst of this crazy situation at the moment. Almost global social and economic lockdown. We've got huge swathes of economies in virtual standstill, and all billions of people under virtual house arrest. It would seem with a huge loss of freedom. And at the centre, we've got this coronavirus, this pandemic issue. There's a lot going on at the moment, and you have shed some light on what's going on behind the scenes in the past. What's your general take on what's happening at the moment?
Well, let me start with the economic because I think this is one that's sort of passed under the radar because everybody's so focused on is it a pandemic or is it the flu? Is it an excuse to take away our freedoms? There's all kinds of scenarios and spinning, but not much has been said about the fact that we're in the midst of the largest bailout of speculators in world history. And this started before there was a single case of the coronavirus. Now, I'm sure most of your listeners know in 2008, the solution was to bail out the speculators, kick people out of their homes in the US and in the UK, and create a new stock bubble. And over the period of about 10 years, they succeeded in getting a new stock bubble. And they called that economic prosperity. But it wasn't. Many people didn't recover their wage levels that they had before the 2008 crash. But the speculators were doing great, except it was all based on debt, accumulation of debt, corporate debt, bonds issued to huge amounts that were used to then buy back stocks, not for plant and equipment, not upgrading the company, not improving the workers' conditions, but to make profits for the shareholders, especially for the executives. And corporate debt grew, government debt ballooned, and consumer debt ballooned. So I think right before the last time I talked to you in the middle of September 2019, the Federal Reserve was forced to intervene in what's called the repo markets, the markets that provide overnight liquidity, because the banks would no longer lend to that because the assets they were getting as collateral were so questionable. So the Fed started lending 20 billion a night, 30 billion a night, 50 billion a night. By the beginning of the year, just as the coronavirus was hitting, it was up to 100 or 120 billion a night the Fed was loaning to these shadow banking institutions, which were loaning it to corporations that were essentially zombie corporations. They had to borrow the money because they couldn't cover the interest on their debt. So this is the financial crisis that's coincided with the pandemic. And in the United States, they used the pandemic. It was necessary to upgrade public health because part of the whole economic foolishness was to downgrade public health and turn everything into for-profit, the insurance, big pharma, hospitals, and so on. But in the meantime, no spending for public health. So we were really caught off guard, not in the sense that we didn't know there was a pandemic, but we had downgraded our public health service for 20, 30 years. So in the midst of that, you had this bailout going on. So they used the pandemic crisis. And look, in the US, there was a $2 trillion package, a relief package, which about 1.5 trillion went to things that were justifiable: hospitals, cities, counties, states, medical associations to get equipment. And then some of it started going to corporations, including corporations that had needed to be bailed out. And then money to families, $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. But then even in the relief bill, there was 450 billion that went to a fund that the Treasury gave guarantees for the Fed to give to corporations to buy stock. So even in the actual relief bill, they had that written in. And then the Fed turned around, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, the so-called independent central bank of the United States, to announce $4 trillion in different kinds of bailouts. They're buying junk bonds, they're contributing money that's going into leverage buyouts. They're buying collateralized loan obligations, the most speculative assets. And who did they put in charge of it? BlackRock, the world's largest equity company, to decide who the winners and losers are. So if you're one of the upper 1% wealthy, the money's flowing to you right now, and you can go and buy the distressed assets, the cheap stocks, and assume that with the Fed putting in the money, they'll appreciate and then sell them off and make a profit. But if you're an average person who's locked down, or a small businessman whose business may be going under, you're left out. You're left on your own. And I don't say that the pandemic caused this. I've written several articles saying this is not a coronavirus depression. The depression was already here, but they're using this to make sure no one can go out in the street and protest. Yeah. And in the U.S. Congress, only one congressman opposed the bailout bill.
Yeah, it's shocking. So the background is that the economic context is, as you say, there was bailout in the process. And for a whole bunch of other reasons that we haven't got time to go into, you know, the economy is in dire straits. So in the midst of this, we've got this coronavirus, but we've got this disproportionate policy. I failed to get my head around why there isn't more opposition to a policy which we're told here in the UK is primarily about not overloading a healthcare system. So it seems to me that we're potentially sacrificing an economy in order to save a healthcare system, which to me seems so back to front that it seems that the policy itself of this lockdown it just seems very questionable at the very best. So I don't know whether you want to speak into that, but then also when you dig a little bit deeper, there are very, very good reasons to question the underlying assumption of a real pandemic. When we look at the way the weaknesses of this PCR test and the process that the Chinese went through in allegedly diagnosing and identifying a virus, so there's so many holes in it. Do you think this points to the economic circumstances you just described? Do they point to the fact that this is deliberate? Is that what you see, or do you see a coincidence?
I see an establishment which is incompetent, stupid, greedy, and willing to kill. And the one thing that was predictable, in fact, Lyndon LaRouche predicted this back in the early 70s when we first started moving into the speculative system. When in 1971, when the dollar was removed from a gold reserve and when the fixed exchange rate was ended, he said this is going to end badly. This is going to end with a series of bubbles. It's going to end with governments going with austerity. And he predicted back in 74 that we're going to see the emergence of either new or old diseases with governments incapable of dealing with it. What Mr. LaRouche said is that it's inevitable that societies are going to get hit with diseases. The question is, why did we tear down the redundancy in the healthcare system in the first place? Because you do need to have doctors, nurses, extra equipment, supplies that are needed. But under globalization, under the economy, the neoliberal economic system that we've had increasingly for the last 30 to 40 years, the just-in-time economy, we had several things happen. We outsourced manufacturing. This is true in the UK and in the United States. So we became dependent on manufactured goods from distant places, the so-called extended supply chains. In the United States, 90% of our pharmaceuticals are produced outside of the United States.
Yep. In China.
So the globalization had that effect. Now, secondly, the question of China, I think, is one that we have to look at carefully. And I'm opposed to this idea of blaming China. You know, I think that's being done by people who want to stop the Belt and Road Initiative and people who want to make sure there's no threat whatsoever to continuing the bankrupt system that we're living under for the last 30 years. Now, did China take a little bit of time to let us know? Well, the actual figures are it was in the end of December that they first started noticing these strange occurrences of large numbers of pneumonia, deaths, and illnesses. By January 4th, they had contacted the World Health Organization and the CDC in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control. So that was a week later. So maybe there was a bit of a lag time, but they then 3 days after that, so 10 days after they first began to track what was going on, they isolated the genome that supposedly was related to the virus. Now, why did the governments in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in Spain, in Germany, in the United States wait 2 months to check and see if they had personal protective equipment? That's not China's fault. It's not China's fault that we outsourced our industry. It's not China's fault that we dismantled our public health sector. So you may say, well, the Chinese weren't as transparent as possible. Maybe they kept the numbers down initially. But I think the problem is that the Western establishment was caught flat-footed. Now, here's where I am concerned about what happens next. Mostly what we're seeing is people who had previous conditions who have passed away as a result of the coronavirus. Elderly, people who maybe wouldn't have lived much longer anyway, people with heart problems, organ problems, and so on. Now, on the one hand, it's terrible to say, well, let those people die. They're going to die anyway, and not shut down the economy. Because we don't know for sure how widespread this can get. We still don't know enough about it. So I'm not one who says it was a mistake to have social distancing and shut down football games and concerts and things of that sort. That doesn't bother me so much. What bothers me is the finger pointing and the blame game, while at the same time, they're creating huge volumes of liquidity, which means future debt, to bail out people who should be shut down. If you want to shut down the economy, let's start shutting down the speculators, including the City of London, the offshore tax havens. That's the problem with the economy. And I'll just add one point to that, Nigel. There's no way to get back to the old normal. Either we're going to have an acceleration of bailouts, which will eventually lead to a hyperinflation, or we're going to have a deflationary crash, or we're going to get enough people coming together and say, look, let's put an end to this neoliberal austerity, Federal Reserve, Bank of England nonsense and get back to real investments in physical economy. Now, the irony is that's what China does.
Yeah. What about those who in this sort of hysteria, anti-China nonsense? How likely do you think is war? I mean, is there sufficient influence? Is there sufficient momentum? What do you see happening there?
Well, I see a huge buildup. In fact, in London on Monday, there was a conference at the Henry Jackson Society, which you may be familiar with. It's a British neocon, but it's actually a US-British neocon operation that had a conference on confronting China, in which they said, we're at war with China now, and China's winning. And they said we need a Western alliance to take this on. Now, the co-sponsor, besides the Henry Jackson Society, was the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council was the organization that was pushing the Russiagate story.
Really?
In a sense, what we're seeing is a shift from Russia, Russia, Russia to China, China, China. And why are they doing that? Well, this establishment, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, needs an enemy image to justify the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars that go into the war industry. And whether you like Trump or not, Trump was moving against this. He was trying to talk to Putin. He was trying to talk to Xi Jinping. He was trying to get a trade deal with China. And they wanted to stop that at all costs. That's why they attacked Russia and said Russia fixed the election in the United States. They went after Ukraine again, as a surrogate for attacking Russia. And now it's China. So is there a danger of war? Well, what I've watched the last couple of days is the US media going after Trump, saying, why aren't you doing more against China? And then the Democrats saying Trump is soft on China, the same way they said he was soft on Putin. So they're trying to provoke him. Now, Trump has said, look, let's do an investigation. If it turns out they did this deliberately, then there'll be consequences. If it's a mistake, it's a mistake. So I think Trump, ironically, the guy who's considered the lunatic, the bully, the bull in the china shop, is putting a little bit of a hold on these neocons and war hawks who otherwise are pushing for a war.
Yeah. And I mean, amidst all this, there's the issue of losses of freedom, isn't there? Because it's unprecedented to with businesses going out of small businesses, sorry, going bankrupt and things that you alluded to earlier. This whole lockdown, it's very setting a very serious precedent for future pandemics or alleged pandemics. What do you think about that, Harley? This, where do you see that going? And do you see some sort of an agenda being forwarded behind that, or again, do you just see, more sort of incompetence? What's your view there with regards to our loss of freedom?
Well, one of the things is that the people who would tend to do this for the wrong reasons, for bad reasons, are already on record as saying they want to reduce the world's population. They're already on record as saying that there's too much freedom. Or on the other side, they want people to just smoke pot and shoot up and turn off, turn out of being involved in anything. So you have on the one side, they promote hedonism and social networking and irrationality in social society. And on the other hand, they don't care if people die. Now, what I'm saying is that these are people who would use a pandemic for this purpose. So whether it was just a convenient happenstance, I think we're going to find that there was not a biological warfare weapon that was used to do this, because the Chinese probably wouldn't do that. I don't know of anyone on the planet that would do that, although I'm very suspicious about Porton Downs and what happened with the Skripal affair and from a couple of years ago. But I think there are people who will use something like this for their broader purposes, and that includes the billionaires club like Bill Gates, who's very much involved in these things, or Bezos of Amazon, the Davos crowd. They had in November of last year a test run. What would you do in case of a pandemic?
Yeah.
Now, if they were serious about dealing with a pandemic, why didn't they then go to the government and say, look, we're not prepared in case a pandemic breaks out? They didn't do that. They just ran a war game scenario.
Yeah.
So it certainly looks suspicious. It might not be an intent, but these are the people who are using this as an opportunity to try to get more money for big pharma, in the process, disrupting the society. But what do they get from shutting down freedom? The only reason they would do that is if they fear that the population is not going to stop with Brexit and with Trump, but is going to go all out in shutting down these speculators and these swindlers. In which case they're looking down the road and seeing that there will be social disruption and social disturbance.
Yeah.
So that concerns me.
Yeah, I think some sort of social disturbance is almost inevitable with the tempers getting frayed if lockdown continues. But yeah, to me it seems that there are so many benefactors. When we sort of stand back and ask the question "Cui bono," it seems to me that Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and these other investors in big pharma and vaccines, that are hefty donors of the WHO. And there's some, foul-smelling connections going on there. And it's the WHO that is calling the shots, declaring the pandemic and so on and so forth. So there are definitely people that stand to benefit, aren't there? Quite clearly.
Well, there are. On the other hand, I happen to have the good fortune of knowing a number of people who are doctors and researchers who do take this seriously and who, are saying we'll find out soon enough if the lockdown worked, if it was necessary, and there'll be plenty of time for retribution afterwards, unless, of course, the lockdown remains in place and is replaced by a total top-down security state. By that I mean, look, there's so much pressure on political leaders in every country to lift the lockdown that if they don't, they're setting themselves up for being tossed out. On the other hand, if they release it prematurely and you do have a new spike in deaths and it starts getting into younger populations or other, and look, the other thing we should look at is take a look at Africa. This idea that you're going to solve the problem by washing your hands. What do you do if you live in a village that has no water?
Well, I think the advice to sort of wash hands is pretty superfluous anyway. But I think the main disingenuous point about the lockdown is that it was initiated on the basis of sort of exaggerated computer models, and let's bear in mind that the PCR test
from the Imperial College of London.
Yes, and the PCR test allegedly was said to have an estimated failure rate, a positive failure rate of 80%. There are so many holes in the story of discovery of the virus, but you've got the lockdown based on these outrageous projections, and then they can say, when of course the projections don't align with reality in any way, and there aren't all these cases, that they're able to say it was the lockdown that worked. And this really concerns me as a disingenuous play that some people may not see through, but it's almost impossible to get away from this lockdown. I mean, okay, admittedly, there are some countries and areas that are not locked down, and that's another interesting story in itself. But I fear that the lockdown will be praised as the successful strategy when, a whole bunch of nothing much happens. And I don't mean any disrespect, obviously, to people that are suffering and dying at the moment.
I think that's something that we'll find out, and it's something that a certain amount of skepticism for authority is always necessary, and especially when you have an establishment as corrupt as the one that we have now that's running things on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, you look at what we're facing. First of all, look at Italy. Italy doesn't have a functional government. The government that was elected in the last national elections was pretty much run out by the EU cutting credit to them. And then when Italy is in dire need of help, the European Union says, unless you support the European Stability Mechanism, which is basically the bank bailouts, you don't get any credit. So, I think the European Union has shot itself in the foot and the head and the groin the way it's handled this thing. One thing that's positive is that the Schengen Agreement went out the window. They basically, countries were forced to protect their borders. And, I think this is one of the ironies when you look at the lockdown and everything else. Who's being attacked the most? The so-called authoritarian leaders. But the lockdown itself is somewhat of an authoritarian policy. So I think there are a lot of ironies here. And I think it's premature to make the conclusion that we're going to have a permanent state of lockdown. Now, I think at a certain point, science will emerge that will give us some answers. And the reason I say that is that if you're going to use completely fake science, like the climate change, what they're trying to do with that, it ultimately doesn't work if you're going to take away people's livelihood, take away their lives on the basis of supporting fake science. Why do you think they can't cram it through when all the bankers and all the governments support it? In the United States, most people don't believe in man-made climate change. And if they're doing a similar fraud around the coronavirus, in the United States, people are not going to accept it. And what we saw with the Trump election is just a foretaste of what will come. So I'm not so worried about that. What I worry about more than that is that people are going to die because of the way the economy is being run, including food problems, food supply problems, not just in poor countries, but they're basically shutting down the beef and pork industry in the United States right now. They're dumping milk. The prices paid to farmers are collapsing.
Ollie,
People
let's
can
again on the basis of what? Not overwhelming healthcare systems. I just don't get it. Why not just overwhelm the healthcare systems and they'll do what they can do and lessons can be drawn? But the idea, how do people sit back and say, "Yeah, lockdown, great idea to slow down the virus"? I mean, it just doesn't stack up. I mean, do you do you think people just concede that lockdown is the answer? I mean, what are the facts supporting the non-movement of people? What are the facts supporting, everybody catching it sooner and quicker, not working out okay? I mean, why are we so frightened of that situation? What are the facts? And nobody talks about those facts, and yet those are allegedly the reasons that we're all locked down.
Well, but Nigel, I think this is where we don't know enough yet for sure. Because if you look at what happened initially with the spread, the fact that there weren't lockdowns may have been contributing to the spread, including people from China traveling around the world. Now, that's something that the president of the United States has emphasized, Trump, that had there been an earlier effort to contain the travel out of China, it might have been prevented, it might have been mitigated. But look, what you're saying is definitely true. Nobody knows enough. And so the question was, do you err on the side of caution, or do you take a wait and see attitude and then find out later that you made a mistake?
Yeah.
Now, this is why I have a certain confidence in the people. I look at what's happened in the last 4 years with Brexit initially, with the Trump election, with elections in Italy and Spain and Germany and France, where the establishment political parties are collapsing. I think people are unhappy with the establishment. And if it turns out that the lockdown was based on fraudulent science, I think there's going to be another explosion of social unrest, which is fine, which is good, because people should be angry. People are losing everything. But they would have lost it without the lockdown. This is why I started with the economy. The whole transatlantic financial system is on a very short fuse because of the volume of debt. And government debt, everyone knows how big that is. The unfunded liabilities, pensions, things of that sort, retirement funds. But people ignore the fact that corporate debt, in the last 3 years, there's been $10 trillion of corporate bonds issued. Over 50% of that is junk bonds. Who's buying it? Speculators who get money from the Federal Reserve. So they can keep these bonds in trading, keep them on book value on their books, face value on their books, so they can keep trading them. But these are things that are worthless, companies that should have been put into bankruptcy.
Do you see this as triggering some sudden implosion, Harley, or do you think we're just going to be in a general decline into depression? Do you see this a calamitous sort of stock market crash, or are we just eroding everything away?
I saw that happening in September. That's why the Fed had to jump in. I mean, look, banks usually handled the overnight repo lending, repurchase agreements, where you loan money for 24 hours based on financial instruments, and then the next day the person you loan it to gives you the money back plus interest, and you give them back their assets. Now, what started happening is the interest rates, because there was such a high demand, the interest rates were going up to 8 to 10%. Now, ordinarily, if you were a bank, wouldn't you want 8 or 10% interest when the federal funds rate is at about 0.5%? But the banks, including JP Morgan Chase, ducked out. Why? Because they started studying the assets they were being given as collateral and realized these were worthless. And sooner or later, they were going to be stuck with $20 billion in loans that would be defaulted. So they said, we're not going to do it anymore. So the Fed jumped in. And the money, as I said, started going up and up and up. Why? Because these corporations are not making profits. They're what are called zombie corporations, where you don't make enough money to pay the interest on your debt. When that happens, you're facing a potential trigger, which we're now seeing in the oil industry in the United States, the oil business, when oil is minus $37 a barrel.
That was crazy.
What that means is that the futures markets and the derivatives are being called in, and no one wants to get stuck holding the physical oil. Because the physical oil is worth less because the derivatives have been pumped up so high, it's all going to come down. So I think the people who made the decision to have the Fed take over the repo markets were seeing a crash on the way. And so in that sense, the coronavirus served as a very useful cover for them to go with a bailout on steroids, a mega bailout, with the expectation that no one would oppose it. Remember, in 2008, in the United States, the House of Representatives voted against the initial bailout.
Yeah. But I mean, when the economy goes over and all of these, people that might be on the edge of repossession, obviously nobody's working at the moment, most people are locked down, the likelihood of not being able to pay debt, etc., is hugely increased at the moment. At the end of all that, the bank ends up holding the cards, do they not? They end up holding the title to that property that okay, the debt's been defaulted on, but the property is then retained by the bank.
The bank does hold, in a sense, the cards because they can take the property. But what happens when there's no one who will be able to buy the property? And the property crashes in value. Now, that's what happened in 2008, and that's why the Fed stepped in and basically bailed out the speculators.
If the Fed is buying up people's property, I mean, I see that as dangerous. I mean,
it's outrageous. It's outrageous. But here's the point: people are not going to tolerate another 6 or 8 million families losing their homes to speculators who are getting money to buy it from the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Why not give the money to the people who are losing their homes? Why not give the money to the small businesses? The banks hold the cards until the point where everyone says, none of us can pay. And then they've lost everything. Right. And that's why a debt reorganization or debt moratoria, jubilee year, whatever you want to call it, is something we could be heading towards. And what the LaRouche organization is saying is restore Glass-Steagall, which says there'll be no bailouts of the banks, no bailouts of the speculators. They'll have to eat their losses. But we will protect the commercial banks with people's savings, people's checking accounts, people's business accounts. Those will be protected.
Yeah.
The real economy, but not the speculative economy.
Well, just one more issue as well, Harley. I'm aware of time and your next engagement. But what do you think will happen as a result? What do you think will happen with immigration policy? In the States, in Europe, do you think that things will change radically? In fact, do you see there being a tourist industry at all? You could argue for the foreseeable, for the immediate short term. How do you see immigration policy? Trump's ideas and the wall and all this sort of stuff in this new context.
Well, in the short term, I think immigration is going to be a casualty of the hysteria. On the other hand, immigration does have to be addressed. I mean, in the United States, we still do have a lot of illegal immigration, which has been a problem. I don't know the situation that well in the United Kingdom, but I know that was one of the issues in the whole Brexit issue and the whole free flow of the European Union. Hopefully what people will do instead of just getting angry is study how an economy should work. What should be the relationship of government to credit policy? Who should determine who gets credit? If it goes through so-called independent private central banks, it's going to go to the big banks that run them in the shadow economy. If it's a government that's run by people who determine where the credit goes, then we can start rebuilding our economies. So I think we're at a turning point where we're not going to continue with the same economic policies we've had because that's collapsing, that's gone. That's a dysfunctional model, the neoliberal model. Now, we also know communism doesn't work, socialism doesn't work. So what works? Well, the old American system, where you have a credit policy run out of the Treasury, but through the private banking system that loans money to people who are going to produce things, entrepreneurs, production, factories, family farmers. So I think we can simplify these things, but it's going to take people who are now waking up, learning these questions that they've been snookered on for the last 40 years.
So the greatest danger of confronting us at the moment is really the economic one, isn't it? It's this economic system change that's so desperate, and as a result of the whole pandemic issue, we're going to see economic collapse. I mean, is that where do you think listeners should be aiming their attention right now?
Well, I think people should aim their focus on making sure we come out of this with a change in the economic policy.
Harley, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate your insight on this whole thing. And is there anything you wanted to say in closing to direct listeners to any more of your work?
Just keep your eye on the economy, and if you want more from me, you can send me an email to my personal email address, and I'll link you up with my blog site for free. So it's harleysch@gmail.com. harleysch@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Harley. And thank you very much for listening. Do check out the website, lawfulrebel.com as well, for a lot more there. Lots of useful information on how to find the truth of what's going on. And hope you'll join me next time for another edition of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.